Samuel Crawford stood on his porch at dawn, the brass case of his pocket watch open in his palm, and a thin film of ice freckling the metal. His calloused fingers held it, as if the ritual kept something steady. The tremor in his hands, 3 winters of hard weather, lean seasons, and the small, persistent grief that had moved into the corners of his life, could be blamed on the cold or on too many early mornings. February wind cut across the Montana Valley like an old man scolding, biting at his ears and the ridge of his cheek, but he barely felt it. The stagecoach from town was late. He told himself the lateness meant nothing. Stagecoaches kept their own calendars when the snow made roads treacherous. He told himself the world had no obligation to interrupt the careful, unmoving rhythm he lived by. Rise with the dawn. Check the fences. Count the sheep. Mend the roof when the sagging snow threatened it. And mark the days by the fullness of the moon and the ache in his joints. But the watch was a ritual, and checking it was the only way he let his mind dwell on what might be missing. For 3 years, the habit had become a measure of absence, of the woman who'd been gone when the fever claimed her, of children that never came, of the conversations he once imagined but never had. This morning the air smelled of frost and distant wood smoke, and the valley was a place of muted color icy blue sky, gray-barked cottonwoods, and the soft white hum of the fields. The stagecoach should have passed the bend at first light. It hadn't. That small lateness stretched into a question, and Samuel felt his chest tighten as if on cue. He closed the watch with a soft snap and slid it back into his waistcoat. The sheep were quiet in their pens, their breath like warm lanterns in the morning air. He would check the road himself. It was a small errand, something to do with the anxiousness at his ribs. The road was a ribbon of hard-packed snow and ice, bordered by fences that leaned like tired soldiers. Tracks showed where a wagon had tried and failed to mount the hill last week, and where a pair of horseback riders had passed through 2 nights ago. He followed the prints, boots finding the frozen rhythm, eyes scanning for anything out of place. She was half buried against a drift, as if the snow had decided she was worth a quiet, respectful cover. The sight of her stopped him more suddenly than he expected. She was not like the women who sometimes came through with children and market baskets. She carried a country refinement that suggested someone who'd rarely been cold enough to know it. Her dress whitish once, now dim with mud and streaks of blood not yet frozen, clung in places and fluttered in others, torn where branches had snagged it. A veil, ripped and entwined with pine needles, masked the top of her hair. Samuel's first practical thought was that she might be alive. The second, strange and immediate, was personal and unbidden. Her fingers were small and curled, as if she held something inside herself tighter than life. A wedding ring glinted on a damp red swollen finger, half concealed by a glove, the dull halo of a promise gone wrong. He knelt because the tilt of the world made him, and because it was the only way to meet her without the raw distance that turns people into strangers. Close enough to share breath, close enough to see the fine color of fear in an eye. Her eyelids fluttered once. A small sound, more a breath than a moan, escaped her. Her lashes were laden with snow, and when she opened her eyes, the gray of them made the wind seem kinder, a steady, weary gray. She looked at him as if memorizing the shape of steadiness. "Miss?" His voice came out softer than he'd expected. It had been a long time since he'd spoken to a stranger and felt his whole face rearranged to look hospitable. She blinked, confusion and relief in equal measure. "Please," she said. The word was thin but urgent. "Don't let them." He moved closer on an impulse that was more human than heroic. Her breath caught when he stepped toward her, a tiny involuntary catch that told him more than words. His hands, those steady farming hands, had a gentleness when needed. He gathered her to his chest the way years of lifting bales and lambs had taught him to cradle weight properly. His coat wrapped about her shoulders, and his calloused fingers brushed the back of her hand as he steadied her. She fit against him like a broken thing mended for the moment, warmth from his body seeping through wool and cotton. He helped her to her feet with the slow, buttoned logic of a man who'd learned to make seams right. Snow sighed off roped branches. She leaned into him, not just for warmth but because the world had been a place to flee, and he was the first steady place she had found. Her name came like a surrender. "Evelyn," she said finally. The name she offered him was honest in its smallness. She was 34, with eyes that had seen life's strictures and a mouth that had learned how to keep counsel. She folded into the cabin heat like a traveler climbing out of an undertow. Samuel set a pot of water on the stove and stirred a handful of coarse grain to make porridge. She sat by the hearth on a stool, hands wrapped around themselves, watching him as if testing whether this house would be another place to fear. He tried to be practical. He peeled away the wet garments and wrapped blankets around her shoulders. He fed her water and helped her peel off a frozen glove, drawing out a wedding band that seemed too heavy with meaning for the slender finger it circled. "Don't, please," she said again. But the plea wasn't for the band. Her voice had been worn thin by running and hiding in the cold. "He's Gideon Hale. Samuel heard the name like a stone dropping into still water. Gideon Hale owned land 3 ranches over and a reputation that made voices shrink. Samuel had seen the man cut down a dog for wandering, swagger into the saloon, and make others shrink back. If Gideon came for a woman, it would be to take what he claimed. Law had often been as soft as ash against his cuffed palm. At the thought, something in Samuel's jaw clenched, an old muscle tightening. "He's a cruel man," Evelyn said simply, words steady despite shaking hands. "He has his reasons. My father." She stopped, jaw holding secrets she wouldn't hand over. Samuel felt the familiar machinery of solitude grind toward the impulse to look the other way. Instead, he offered what he had: shelter, a bowl, a place by the fire. He didn't ask where she intended to go. Any direction she'd sought had already broken a promise. He only asked, quietly, "Do you want to talk?" She laughed once, edged with exhaustion and a small, incredulous astonishment. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight, I want to not be just a rumor." He made a bed on the floor by the hearth with spare blankets. The loft stairs were too steep for a woman with chilled hands. He watched her breathe slow and regular against the coarse wool, and then stepped outside, letting the night fold back over him. The awareness of another presence in the house took the shape of a question. What now? By dawn they were in separate rooms. Evelyn in the better bed, Samuel had reluctantly offered, hair unpinned and steaming faintly at the edges from the stove's heat. Samuel with the familiar press of duties in his hands. Both were newly aware, as if the small, bright sore of being seen had been opened in them. The distance between them had shifted, subtle and decisive, like the tilt of a map when a landmark is discovered. Act 2. Proximity creates tension. The valley slid back into its ordinary rhythms, and Samuel's life accommodated this wild, sunburned page in its margins. He had intended his existence to be ordered. He had not intended it to be generous. That morning, when he led his sheep out to the fields, Evelyn walked with him to the gate, wrapped in one of his heavier coats and a scarf that smelled faintly of mint from the soap she kept in her pocket. She moved as if physical tasks were both refuge and a new way to measure courage. Handling the animals throwing grain, calling the Iwe lambs was something she adapted to with determined grace. A kind of competence that made Samuel's chest twist in a way he hadn't named in years. There were small, steady details that drove feeling between them into a slow, delicious ache. It began with the way she bent to lift a wayward lamb, hair tumbling loose over one shoulder, fingers nimble. Samuel found himself watching the line of her throat, the way her jaw set as she concentrated. Once, when a lamb slipped into a frozen ditch, he clung down to haul it up, and Evelyn's hand found his forearm as she leaned in. Her hand was warm, the skin soft but with the faint grain of labor. The contact half-breath of two people accomplishing a task made something threaded through Samuel that had been braided with winter and solitude loosen and uncurl. Their touches became accidental like weather patterns, tiny and frequent. She dried a pan and their fingertips brushed. His calloused fingers brushed hers, and the small shock of it made both of them aware. He handed her a hot mug, and his palm lingered against hers, the heat traveling up like a messenger. There was a moment when she stood so close he could smell cedar and wash on her, a scent that wandered behind his ribs and set his pulse to a new reckoning. The charged air between them felt like summer in a Montana winter. They watched each other when the other wasn't looking. Evelyn would pause with a cup held in both hands and study Samuel as if memorizing the lines of his face. He, in turn, would find reasons to be in the same room, to lean on the same table, to sit on the same porch railing she used when she stepped outside to hang laundry like frosted pennants. The house filled with an awkward intimacy that had not been planned. Neighbors brought bread, a cloth with warm mutton fat, questions muttered about her condition. Those small attentions touched the edges of something more palpable. Not only were they sharing space, but they were beginning to share life. Gossip travels like wind in small communities. News of a runaway bride reached ears wary and hungry for scandal. One afternoon, as Evelyn and Samuel worked the flock along a bluff that gave them a view of the still frozen creek, a rider came down the lane. His coat was too fine to be a hired hand's. The shadow he cast was broad with intent. Gideon Hale's name hung on the air when a messenger demanded explanation. The visitor did not come as a gentleman, but as a man expecting his property returned. His voice braided entitlement and threat, and the men he sent ahead were as flat-faced as any tasked with doing unpleasant things for another's will. Their questions pressed like fingers. Where is she? Who fed her? Who harbored her? The community circled with cautiousness that kept conversation low and eyes flicking away from Samuel's yard. Samuel's protectiveness, shaped by a life of being small among the big, hardened like gum on a cold boot. He refused to hand her over. He had no claim to be her rescuer, but there was something in him that could not abide a bully's appetite being sated by fear. He had little law to brandish, but he had fences, dogs, and a slow, stubborn respect from people who'd known him for years. He stood in front of his cabin and let the wind pull his coat tight around his chest. "She's safe here," he said. The winter creaked and everything seemed to listen. Evelyn watched the exchange and felt the heat of it settle into her like a balm. She had been taught to be small, to make less noise than her danger. But the square set of Samuel's jaw and the way his hands curled closed conveyed a different truth. He would take responsibility without drama, without claiming her as prize. It was a claim that honored her autonomy, even as it steeled his stance against those who would erase it. The first deliberate touch came on a night when a storm threw itself at the cabin as if the world had become a chorus of pressing things. They sat by the fire, knees almost touching, the light painting them in slow gold. Outside, the valve whined complained. Inside, the kettle sang its long, soft note. Evelyn's hand lay limply on her lap, fingers worrying the frayed seam of a blanket. Samuel's hand, resting nearby, found hers with no suddenness, just the easy gravity of two things drawn together. His thumb rubbed the inside of her wrist in small circles, as if testing the pulse there. When his thumb brushed the inside of her palm and traced the roadmap of veins and tendons, something like a held breath found release between them. Close enough to feel his heartbeat, she realized the smallness of want. "You're afraid it will mean something you'll regret," Samuel said, not looking at her but speaking to the thought he'd guessed. A low voice she would have believed even if it hadn't come from him. Evelyn's reply was a whisper. "I'm afraid it will mean everything." It was not a full confession so much as a truth that warmed itself against the fire. There were nights when proximity meant brushing knees, shared blankets, the private warmth of a body close enough to count another's heartbeat. The small sensual awakenings were not stormy epiphanies, but the slow understanding that tenderness could be fierce. He caught her looking once. His shoulder flexed with a quiet restraint, every muscle tense with holding still. The effort it cost him was visible, his jaw clenched, breath a hair tighter. Her own restraint wavered in moments when she let her hair down and did not fuss at how it fell. She discovered she could want without it undoing her. A heat pooled low in her belly when he smiled. He, too, learned to want with patience. Fear came with the territory. Evelyn had fled because she knew the compliance life had in store, marrying. Gideon would mean a life where kindness was odd and obedience measured worth. She had learned to be small so her family might keep what was left. The memory of the night she'd run, the thunder of horses, the cold in her face, the hands that had tried to drag her back as if her body were not hers, made her occasionally recoil from Samuel's gentleness. She would step back, making 6 inches into 6 feet when habit demanded distance. He mirrored her caution. Samuel was not a man of many words. His love had been measured and then lost, and he had taught himself to be careful with the wants that made life sudden. Yet when he saw her flatten her shoulders to deny the way her mouth softened for him, some part of him battened down and leaned in at once. The first time he reached up and brushed a wayward strand of hair from her collarbone, the touch was an electric little shock. His calloused thumb traced her jaw rough against soft, and she trembled. A thin, private signal that said everything he did not yet have the courage to voice. One night, as snow smothered the world outside and hushed like mercy, Samuel and Evelyn sat on opposite sides of the hearth and traded pasts. Evelyn's voice, when she spoke of her upbringing, was careful. Her fingers toyed with the hem of her dress when she mentioned the man who'd been promised to her. Samuel's history was not colorful. He'd loved a woman who died too young, and that absence had hollowed a room of his life where laughter used to sit. Evelyn's presence added a line to his ledger he had not expected to sign. At the end of that night, they sat very close on the bench, the fire gilding them in amber. Their shoulders brushed. Her hand covered his His hand found hers firmly, like an anchor thrown and caught. No words were said. In the hush, a power lay between them like waiting, both fierce and tender, a readiness to be seen that frightened them more than the storm. And then, as if fate waited to test them, a deputy from town arrived, hat in hand, face serious. He brought news that Gideon had served a writ demanding Evelyn's return. His voice carried the legal weight people tended to defer to, even when small kindnesses had been at stake. Samuel's throat tightened at the recognition of the letter, at law used as a highwayman's cloak. Evelyn paled. "They're going to take me back," she said, the words small and raw. Samuel's chest filled with a cold unrelated to weather. He thought of Gideon's heavy laugh and the hard smell of his tobacco. He pictured the futures a woman like Evelyn would meet if she were taken from the safety of his yard and delivered into that man's hands. The protective impulse rose like water to a breach. He would not be the sort of man who stood aside. He'd learn to take action. He had sheep to move, fences to mend, winters to weather. He had no fight in him for the sake of fighting, but when something worth protecting stood in the way, he could muster a courage practical and stubborn. He told the deputy in a low, steady voice, "She's under my roof. If he wants to lay claim, he'll have to do it in front of the people. He'll have to show why." The man nodded and left with a promise of a hearing rather than a night raid. It bought them a day. That night, the gravity of the law made Evelyn withdraw. "I shouldn't have come here," she said, smaller than she wanted to be. "Then go," he said in the way men sometimes say the thing that conceals deeper meaning. "Go if it's what you need." She shook her head. "No, not now. Not with him on my heels. I don't trust myself to run again." His hand found hers under the table. "Then don't run," he said. It was not an order but a small offering of steadiness, a request that she gamble on him. Evelyn splayed her fingers across his. "And if I fail you?" she asked, her voice raw with the vulnerability that made her appear smaller than she was. "You won't," he said. It was less proof than vow, but it steadied her. Act 3. Tension breaks and rebuild storms have ways of revealing what is already broken underneath. The hearing in town was cramped with expectation. People came because petty curiosity will often bring out the worst in tender matters, and because there is always a hunger to see the proud humbled. Gideon Halley arrived with swagger meant to fill the room. He spoke as if citing a law equaled rightness and used townsfolk whispering to his advantage, relying on a common desire to avoid involvement when powerful men were angered. He claimed property, her promise, her betrothal, the papers signed by a father who had sold the family's dignity under the pretense of securing security. Evelyn's cheeks burned as the facts of her life were read. To her the papers meant nothing. To Gideon they were currency. Samuel spoke for her the plain way a man who'd spent years negotiating with live animals learned to speak. He brought witnesses who had seen her leave her father's home the night that became the hinge of their lives. He spoke of a woman who came to him injured and afraid and of shelter given without claim. He held his gaze on Gideon with a steady look that said more than rage could. "She's here of her own will," Samuel said. "You can't take a woman's life like you take one of your cattle," Gideon sneered. And for a moment it threatened to scatter the proceedings. But townsfolk who'd been wearied by Gideon's petty cruelties began to shift. Liza from the livery spoke up about seeing Evelyn head to Samuel's porch. An old miner nodded about a time Gideon had claimed grain. It wasn't a heroic chorus so much as a reluctant alignment, people who had endured bullies and now saw someone willing to stand. Faced with unexpected witnesses, Gideon grew dangerous in the way men do when pride is threatened. He lurched toward the stand as if to take the room by force. Samuel stepped between them like a wall, not with bravado, but because it was the only thing that made sense. Gideon reached out. Samuel caught his hand. For an instant muscle met muscle, the fine line between self-defense and violence obvious. "You'll regret this," Gideon hissed into Samuel's ear. Samuel's jaw tightened. "This isn't our fight, Gideon," he replied. "It is if you make it mine." His voice was small in the large room, but carried the iron of a man who would not yield without consequence. A hush held. Gideon's face reddened like a bruise. The crowd shifted as if waiting to see which way the wind might blow. At last Gideon advanced and found law and town alignment had teeth. His supporters stepped back. The men tasked to carry out his orders had no stomach for a fight that would leave them with only shame. Gideon left the hearing that day with temper and a formal promise to obey the law. Empty words when you knew the man, but he left. They rejoiced in small ways afterward. Evelyn laughed at a stale joke Samuel told badly, and tension contracted like a held breath released. But the crisis had peeled back the paint on both of them. They were rawer, more real, and the vulnerability of survival replaced the coyness with which they'd tried to navigate attraction. Separation renders the heart a raw instrument. For 3 days after the hearing, Gideon harassed from a distance. A rider posted too long on the ridge, men lingering to watch the house like vultures testing the perimeter. Evelyn, frail with adrenaline spent, retreated into herself. Samuel, who had thought himself done with sudden flashes of desire, found absence turned wanting into a living, painful thing. At night he tossed in a bed that felt too empty. By day his hands moved with the habits of a half-distracted man. He dropped a hammer, forgot to feed the hens, found himself staring at a place over the mantel where a photograph might have hung had he allowed himself such soft rebellions. Evelyn's quiet voice echoed through his days, her small laugh, the way her hand had fit into his during the stove's soft watching. For Evelyn, separation was recrimination. She had sought to save herself, and feared she had endangered the man who sheltered her. Guilt had been a heavy companion all her life, and to watch Samuel's porch look lonelier was almost unbearable. She stopped spending evenings by the fire, claiming chores and lingering outside in the cold where the sky made no promises in return for hope. Need broke their stoicism. It wasn't merely physical. It was the sense of an emotional center they'd found in one another. Evelyn's hands remembered the line of his jaw like a map. Samuel's mouth remembered the curve of her shoulder like an old echo. Wanting had become a kind of unspoken necessity. They feared what desire might undo, because in wanting it, they might lose the parts of themselves that had endured and survived. One night the barn alarm collapsed stall roof and wind sent Samuel into the dark, and Evelyn followed. They worked together in the cold, pushing boards, securing animals. Awkwardness soothed by labor. Afterwards they stood close, breath fogging the air. The smell of hay and horse and leather heavy between them, its counterpart the faint scent of leather and man that settled at the edge of the moment. "Stay with me tonight," Samuel said before he could talk himself back to safe ground. It was simple, almost clumsy. It was an honest sentence that did not beg but asked. Evelyn's answer was a soft smile and a nod. There was no grand ceremony, just two people who had been broken and were deciding to risk mending in tandem, stitch by careful stitch. That night they did not talk of the future. They allowed themselves to be seen the way one looks at someone else in near dark, with a willingness to notice rather than a glare that forces truth. When their heads met, the kiss that followed was not wild but slow, a deliberate pressing of lips and breath that had waited for permission. Samuel's hand lifted to cradle the back of Evelyn's head, fingers threading into sleep-mussed hair. Her own fingers found the hem of his shirt. The charged air between them hummed with restraint and longing. The kiss deepened for a moment, then softened and retreated into the private chamber of two people learning what had been missing in their lives. What happened next was firelight and discovery, whispered names, and the slow, sacred unwrapping of two people who'd forgotten what it meant to be wanted. Dawn found them tangled on the living room floor, covers pulled around their knees, her head on his chest, his hand in her hair. Neither had words. None were needed. They had crossed a bridge by way of softness and consent and the kind of passion that grows from shared respect. Vulnerability had not left them weak. It had made them whole in small, important ways. Act 4, earned intimacy morning after as our quiet examinations of truth. Light slid through the shutters and found them in a peace that felt earned. Samuel woke to the steady rise and fall of Evelyn's chest against his, the regularity of it like a bell. He felt her arm draped across his ribs. Her simple presence declared life could be different. He watched the fine line of hair at her temple, and the way lashes whispered shadow over her cheek. He breathed her in cedar and soap and the faint warm tang of the night they'd shared. These were the small, private facts you collect when you live with someone. Evelyn, awake to soft pressure and muted sounds of Samuel moving, felt serenity she hadn't expected. There was confidence in how he made coffee and moved through the house, a practical, caring muscle memory that made the ordinary palpably generous. When she slid out of bed to make herself presentable, she found his shirt by her shoulders, large and comfortable, fitting like an embrace. Putting it on felt less like adopting comfort than stepping into a permission she had given herself. There was still Gideon Hawley. Threats don't dissolve because two people found each other in the dark. But their union made them less willing to scatter. Gideon's men, seeing the town wary of an untethered demand, began to lose heart. The sight of two who had stood together in public had a way of shaming petty assaults. Small courtesies returned, buoyed by the sense that a wrong done to one should not be left unremarked. Samuel and Evelyn chose not to make spectacles of their affection. Their tenderness was purposeful and small. A hand on the small of a back passing in a doorway, the brush of lips at the top of a stair, a shared chuckle when the stove smoked because someone forgot to stir the pot. One morning she wore his hat and he watched her at the fence, counting sheep. The truth of partnership settled into them. She moved with a confidence shaped by being seen and wanted. He moved with a softness honed by the willingness to protect something precious. They spoke frankly of the future over evenings tasting of stew and the soft smoke of cedar. Evelyn wanted to know if there would be place for autonomy, travel, small pleasures that were hers. Samuel wanted to know if she could forgive him for times his grief folded him in on himself. They negotiated love with the pragmatism of people who'd borne too much to trust facile promises. One afternoon, when thaw puddles marked the road's edges, Gideon returned with less swagger and more caution. The hearing story had traveled. Men who might once have bent to his will looked away. Some of his crew whispered of better ledgers. He spoke to Samuel on the porch, trying to reclaim what he thought owed him. "You don't understand what you've gotten into," Gideon said. "Hale men expect obedience. We're not Hale men," Samuel replied, voice level. "We're not anybody's property." Gideon tried threats, his usual currency. But the town, leaning toward change with a cautious curiosity, watched. They'd seen Samuel's steadiness and Evelyn's refusal to be less than herself. Standing together had become a power that didn't need brazen shows. Gideon left not with clean surrender, but with a venomous promise to return if chance favored him. Samuel and Evelyn stepped closer, and their closeness made something plausible. Love could be both shelter and weapon. They had roots that might withstand a winter, rather than fragile blossoms waiting to be trampled. Their love, once private and sharp, settled into the pleasurable seams of domestic life. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Evelyn liked coffee with only a touch of sugar, the loose habit Samuel had of whistling off key while mending a fence. They taught tacit languages, a look meaning someone was listening outside, a hand pressed to a thigh when courage was needed. Their sensual life, born of touch and respect, grew deeper, calmer, more honest. One night months after the first snow, Samuel and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched a thin green light shiver across the sky. The moment of unguarded wonder made both feel like children. He reached for her. She took his hand without thinking. Having learned the generous truth, desire is not surrendered, but owned and shared. "Stay," he said, a single word holding 1,000 smaller promises. "I will," she replied. "I choose to stay, Samuel. Not because I have to, but because I want to." The word wanted came clean and true. No small thing after her life of being made small. They married on an afternoon quiet and full, no grand ceremony. Only neighbors who'd become friends, small hands offering food and laughter. There was tenderness in Samuel's gaze as Evelyn walked to him. She wore no veil and no ring that seemed to bind. Her look said have fought for freedom and found love. Their vows were simple and strong. Mutual respect, protection without ownership, passion tethered to gentleness. Their bed was not a place of declaration, but of constant discovery. The first time they reached for each other at dusk, and the last when they dozed entangled, they moved with knowledge they'd been desired and chosen. The morning after the night they'd finally given themselves to one. Another after lips and breath, and the fade to black where breath and fire and whispered names did the rest. Evelyn woke with her head on Samuel's chest. He fingered in her hair. She smelled his skin and the oatmeal he'd burned a little. The world felt more generous. They built a life from small materials, fences mended, lambs born in spring, biscuits pulled from a cast iron pan that tasted like triumph. Intimacy was an unspooling, a slow untying of knots that had bound them to old fears. To be held became a gift. To hold another, a discipline of kindness. Evelyn learned to love the roughness of his hands that could coax a lamb from a hutch or cup a woman's cheek with equal ease. Samuel learned to love how she could walk into a room and make it lighter with a small joke, the soft certainty of her gaze that said he was enough. Together they found tenderness that did not ask them to be less to be loved. The valley changed in small rhythms. Gideon Hale moved his focus elsewhere, a tempered threat but no longer a sword at their throat. The town, having watched a woman assert herself and a man choose to stand with her, shifted in ways it hadn't known it needed. People found whispers of courage to speak up when someone's dignity was at stake. It was a quiet ripple born where bravery meets simple decency. Days folded into years. There were storms and losses and days when wrongs happened and their shoulders bore them. There was loud laughter and quiet shared grief. They held each other with the knowledge that love is a craft of persistent kindness. Their passion, kindled in the slow burn of mutual regard, seasoned by trust, became both flame and hearth. What came after was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, morning mouths and sleeping arms, the small, constant language of two people who had chosen one another.